All right, so Mr. Gerber here. So we're coming into now chapter 24. So bringing back in the items from chapters 21 and 22, when we talked about kind of European exploration, we sort of hit on things like the Columbian Exchange a little bit in chapter 22, as well as the meaning behind European travel. But for the most part, we were focusing on travel going into the Indian Ocean and into the Pacific. So kind of some more talking about India and the Portuguese trading empires, and then that being replaced by the British and the Dutch putting in their trading posts, or not their trading posts, but their Dutch and British East India companies, essentially being joint stock companies that are kind of moving their peoples and groups in the direction of mercantilism and capitalism in order to essentially make money off of international trade coming out of China and India to offset and essentially move around the Muslim traders and the Muslim merchants that were existing inside the Middle East along the Silk Road that they were reliant upon. So trying to cut out the middleman and then make money on their own. Again, aided by all this technology. And when we sort of alluded a little bit to stuff going on within the Americas, because this is happening at the same time, we completely, not completely, but we neglected a bit on that because much of chapter 24 focuses primarily on the Americas and the role that the Europeans have on that. So that's kind of what chapter 24 is going to be going over. And so while we talked about New Worlds, the Americas, and Oceania, we're really not referring too much about Oceania. The book talks about a little bit of stuff with, the Europeans coming in, predominantly, talking about Captain Cook, and, the British going into Australia and things like that. But for the most part, we're not really going to cover that at all here. So we're primarily focusing on the Americas itself. Right. So in class, what we would have done is going over the Columbus letter and a number of other primary documents as well, looking at Columbus as he sails in 1492 to find that faster route to the East Indies, and thinking instead of going around Africa as the Portuguese had done and would continue to do, he is going to head westward and assume that eventually he will get himself to the Indies, and essentially that's what he thinks he hits, and that's why they're called the West Indies, or what's going to be in the Caribbean anyway, the West Indies, instead of hitting the East Indies. And so that letter that he sends to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, who had been founding his exploration and his journeys and his voyages, essentially he writes this really I shouldn't say bombastic, but very much a very positive letter of, look at all the beautiful islands and all the resources here and all the native people who, they don't really do any physical labor and they're impressed by the littlest things that we have. We can give them little trinkets and they're completely amazed by it because they have no knowledge of this stuff, and it's completely new to them. And so we're also going to try and spread Christianity around. And so that's kind of what we would do more in class, and that's what we do in class. So this video isn't necessarily covering that. And the purpose would have been to understand what Columbus said to those who funded his trip. And part of that is also about the analysis of why is Columbus writing the letter in such a way? And it comes back to the idea that he is trying to fund more voyages. He's trying to impress upon them that this is worth investing in. I'm worth investing in. What I have done is going to be worth your time because it's going to bring glory, money, wealth, power, prestige back to Spain. All right. And so we're kind of skipping through that here. And so just kind of the whole thing here is that as a result, Europeans will continue to go in the direction that he does over the next couple hundred years in terms of exploration and beyond to, again, push for more European input in the Americas, as they'll eventually discover, hey, this isn't just like a bunch of islands that are, he's off by a little bit in the East Indies, thinking he's hit like Indonesia or the Philippines. No, he is so much further away. And when they start discovering that there's this massive land beyond, where he hit in the Caribbean. All right. And so what this leads to, obviously, is the conquest and the destruction of American Indian culture, in terms of loss of land and life as well, and the beginning of the new slavery systems that are going to arrive here in the Americas, first with the indigenous populations, and then being replaced by, unfortunately, African slavery. Europeans will establish their own colonies, state resources, spread religion, and increase trade between other Europeans. So you can kind of see, at that same time where we have, Ptolemy Diaz's, as a Portuguese explorer going into the Cape of Good Hope, and then Da Gama happening after Columbus had come over here, and then kind of the other, expeditions and explorations going into and around the Americas, i.e. Ferdinand Magellan. All that comes out of the fact that Columbus went this direction instead of this direction. All right, and so the trading post empires that we referred to back in chapters 21 and 22 are coming out of, here's the Portuguese ones here, going into India and then beyond with, Spain here in the Philippines, and then Africa playing very important roles in that as stopping points along the way, as well as for slavery posts that we're unfortunately going to come back to with chapter 25. All right, so Columbus and the Tano. So a number of the other things that we would look at in class would be, a number of primary source documents relating to predominantly the Spanish input on what they saw within the Americas, how they viewed the native peoples, how they looked at religion, the Encomienda system, the reasons behind that. Is it okay? Is it not okay? As well as, a few things that kind of contradict, how we should be treating the American Indians. Is this okay? And also throwing in a few of their perspectives as well. And so that would kind of help set up this understanding of, why the Spanish in particular treated the American Indians in such a way to help set up kind of the background knowledge, or setting up this kind of background knowledge to kind of then explain all of this. So once the Spanish first come in, they realize and they start looking for, gold, they start mining for it, they're looking for other resources to make this, a valuable journey instead of just, necessarily crops. And essentially they are compelling the Tano, which are essentially the people inside of, the West Indies, the Caribbean, on the, on this set of massive islands. And they're compelling the Tano to essentially mine and farm for them because the Europeans don't bring over their own people, or at least not enough of their own people to work the land. There's not a whole lot of compelling reasons for people to give up their life in Spain and Portugal to do that. Instead, it's like, hey, you can be in charge of a bunch of American Indians and have them work the land for you and get rich off of that. At least that's kind of the measure of it. And so they're using the government with this, they're using religion with this, and essentially under this Encomienda system, you can kind of see the plan versus the reality. All right, because they said that this system is going to benefit both the settlers as well as the Tano themselves. All right, and it doesn't work out that way because the Spanish settlers are supposed to protect, care for, and then Christianize the Indians. So pushing in the Christian religion again is another big theme of that, as we said in previous chapters. That what are the Europeans looking for when they are going into the Americas and into their areas of exploration, even into India and Africa and beyond. It's for silk, spices, Christians. All right, and so this is no different. The only difference is now is the way in which they are kind of pushing for Christianity. And again, that gets played in very well with the primary documents that we were looking at, or we would be looking at in class, that you can also find on Schoology. And so the idea is, in order for the Spanish to, offer all these things to the indigenous peoples, they in turn will work a portion of their time and on the land for the Spanish settlers, looking for, crops, mining for gold, things like that. The Spanish settlers would force them to work, and the reality is they would force them to work long labor. They don't pay the workers. They fail to protect them, and then instead seizing their land. And on top of that, you have very harsh treatment, very physical labor, overbearingly so, where they're malnourished, overworked, and undertaken care of. So there's not a whole lot of things to protect them, as well as the diseases that the Europeans are bringing over, things like smallpox that the Europeans had built up a bit of an immunity to over several centuries. That the indigenous populations, because of their lack of contact with the Afro-Eurasian world, they have no immunity set up to protect them from all these other diseases that have existed in Afro-Eurasia for centuries, that they've all built up some sort of resistance and strain to. And so they die from diseases and that harsh living and working conditions, and it's so bad that, again, this is where those documents would come in. They actually end up ending the Encomienda system, in around the 1540s, 1530s, and 50s, because of how many people are dying as a result. Not just the Tano, but the Maya, the Aztec, Incas, other peoples living in the American mainlands, dying as a result of the harsh treatment as well as the diseases and warfare as well, killing millions and millions and millions throughout North, South, and Central America. And, that's kind of the unfortunate scenario within this, is that it takes pleas from, Jesuit clergy and other Catholic people who see this as a harsh system. There's some that just kind of turn a blind eye. as well as the number of slave revolts that are happening as a result, or Indian revolts happening as a result, to finally end this system. And it gets replaced, as we'll see, with other things that don't necessarily make it a whole lot better. As we said, Spanish first enslaved them, but then due to diseases and poor conditions, leads to it being outlawed, and then they begin to replicate it instead with African slavery. So the big reason for why that ends up happening is that, again, tying that into the idea of the sugarcane plantations that the Portuguese have learned from the Muslims and had been set up in Spain, in Sicily, and then the Portuguese and the Spanish had kind of moved that into the Atlantic, into areas off of Europe and Africa. And then they decide, hey, we can replicate this here in the Americas, and let's use this indigenous population to grow these crops in large numbers. And that's essentially what they were predominantly working on. We'll see that they work on other things as well, followed again by African slaves. But again, this is kind of what the setup was to use these peoples for essentially manual labor to make money off of them. All right. In terms of why we see the division of, at least within, if you've ever wondered why Brazil is the only country in South and Latin America and Central America that speaks Portuguese and everyone else essentially speaks Spanish, is because of the way that this line was drawn. The Treaty of Tordesillas, which is signed in 1494, that the Pope agrees to and says, well, look, we have these two Catholic powers, Portuguese and Spain, that have a head start on the rest of Europe due to their location and their navigation and travel. So rather than fight over it, let's divide this new world between themselves. So essentially, to be cutting the world in half, this entire realm was predominantly going to be Portuguese, and the rest of it was going to be Spanish beyond that, hence why Brazil essentially falls into that category. All right. And then other Europeans, through right of exploration and the ideas of conquest and putting up settlements, then begin to essentially establish their other colonies throughout the Americas and then in other places as well, as we kind of saw again back in chapter 22 with the Dutch, the French, well, not really the French, but the Dutch and the British predominantly with their, joint stock companies. So it's one thing when we talk about the Tano, here in the Caribbean, but what happens in, South and Central America, where we talk about, we've set up these massive, empires with the Aztec and the Incas, well, they have millions of people and they have a pretty strong bureaucracy and militaries. What happens? Well, the Conquistadors come in the 1519, or you can kind of see here, Hernan Cortez comes in 1519, essentially kind of into Mexico. And, they are, as we kind of have seen, astonished, at least with some of the test questions, astonished at, kind of the wealth that exists here. But they begin to sort of decide, well, we have this knowledge now that we have a right to Christianize them, but also, try and maybe take over a little bit, as we'll see with Pizarro and the Incas, which are, again, separate by, a couple hundred, if not thousands of miles. So there's not a whole lot of communication between the Aztec and the Incas about what's going on. And so as we kind of see through those primary documents again, they're able to essentially offset the numbers because the Spanish only have a couple hundred with them. And that even with the guns and cannons, it's not a whole lot to overtake, populations in the millions or the tens, if not hundreds of thousands that could effectively oppose them. But we got to remember that the Aztecs have a lot of enemies because of their constant, warring, constant asking for tribute. Same thing with the Incas. That leads to essentially, that people willing to essentially fight and join up with the Spanish against the Aztec and the Incas because of that, and playing these sides off of each other, as well as again the effectiveness of disease that wipes out so many people because of again that lack of immunity or the immune system. So they're able to overthrow those indigenous governments, and we'll kind of again explain that a little bit more, what that looks like in terms of what they get replaced by, kind of in the next video. But yeah, and then we begin to see kind of the formation of new cultures that are kind of a mixture of Spanish and indigenous cultures inside of all of the Americas, as well as, again, that push for Christianity. And again, some of that ties into within the Aztecs with the Spanish because based on their calendar, they were figuring that, essentially like a god that was supposed to be pale-faced was supposed to arrive essentially in 1519, 1520, and they kind of mistook Cortez for that and would be more apt to join them as a result, as well as the push of, Spanish missionaries, again, which we'll explain a little bit more. So, again, as we kind of previously mentioned, that will also impose the Encomienda system, which will, and when that ends, will be replaced by African slavery and a mestizo culture based on dead peonage or sharecropping. So that kind of helps to explain kind of the reasons behind the movement westward, and then kind of the initial reactions, the initial movements of the Spanish, and lifestyles that are going to be put in place, which we'll expand on in the next video.